Hi everybody, here we are ready to start Unit 2. And for the start of Unit 2, we're going to learn about a new organism called fungus, or fungi for plural. And I have this picture here. You can see that some fungi we use as food. We like to eat mushrooms and things. But fungi are really diverse, and so we're going to look at some of that diversity today and learn what makes a fungus a fungus. So here we go. The first thing to realize is that fungus are very unique organisms, and they're so unique that they belong in their own kingdom. So there was a time when researchers thought they might have been more closely related to plants, but we realize as we learn more and more about them that they're really so unique that they belong in their own category. So, however, we did think that they were more related to plants, but it turns out they're actually more related to animals. And so some of the reasons that they are is one, just like animals, they are heterotrophic. So they do need to get their nutrition from other sources, unlike the plants that can create that nutrition or use the sun's energy in order to create glucose and other sugars and things like that. So being heterotrophic, again, that means that you have to eat food. And then you need to break down the food and absorb those molecules into the body. So that's the next one. Both fungi and animals use what's called absorptive nutrition. So what that means, so think of us first. You eat food and you bring it into a chamber in your body called the stomach. And within the stomach, and then also within the small intestines, you take that food and you break it down into small molecules. It's those small molecules that we're able then to absorb across that organ into the blood vessels. And then the blood vessels is what distributes it to all of our cells. So it's that absorption through the tissues of your small intestine to get it to the blood vessels. That's the absorptive portion where we're absorbing the nutrition so that it can get distributed throughout the body. Well, fungi do that as well. They don't put it into a chamber. They actually digest their food outside of their body. So their cells will lay over the thing that they're going to receive nutrition from, and they actually excrete enzymes outside of their cells over the piece of food that they're going to eat. It breaks down into the small molecules outside of the cell body and then gets absorbed into their body. And you've all witnessed this if you've left a piece of food out and it gets moldy. That's a fungus on there. And you can see an orange or a tomato, something you might have left on your counter, and you can see it actually getting smaller and smaller. That's because the fungus is digesting outside of its body the food molecules. When they're small enough, then it can be absorbed into their cells. And I'll show you a little bit later what their cells actually look like. And then they can also store any surplus food. So just like we do, we bring food into our body and we don't use it all immediately, we store it. And so they store it into the carbohydrate glycogen. And we do the same. Animals do the same. When we ingest food and we obtain glucose, a carbohydrate, we will take that glucose and link it together and form a storage form of the molecule called glycogen. Okay? And so that's another characteristic similar to fungi. And this last bullet will make more sense toward the end of the semester. So animals as well as fungi, in some of our cells we can produce little structures called flagella, and that helps for cells to move. So that's a similar structure that we see in both fungi and animalia. So again, we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Okay. More characteristics of fungi. So fungi are, their cell types are called eukaryotic. And in fact, the plant cell types were called eukaryotic. Our cell types are eukaryotic. The only organism that doesn't have a eukaryotic cell type are the bacteria and another organism called archaea. And again, we'll talk more about those later on in the semester. But it says right there in the slide that our eukaryotes are a type of cell that have organelles that are bound by a membrane. So those are things, if you took general bio or you remember from your high school biology class, those are things like our endoplasmic reticula, that's a membrane-bound organelle. The mitochondria is a membrane-bound organelle. So organisms like bacteria and archaea, they don't have those organelles. They're like separate little factories inside of our cells. In bacteria and archaea, which are prokaryotic cells, they lack those membrane-bound organelles. So again, later in the semester, we'll talk about why that's important and how that's different for those organisms. So again, characteristics of fungus, we saw some of this already because some of these are similar to animals where they are heterotrophic. They can absorb nutrients, and once they do absorb those nutrients, then the cells can grow pretty quickly. So that's how a fungus can actually spread pretty quickly. Their cells are also bound by a cell wall. We saw that similarity with plants. In fact, that's one of the reasons why early researchers thought fungus were more closely related to plants, because of the cell wall structure. But if you recall, in plants, one of the major structures in a plant that creates a cell wall is cellulose. But in fungus, the carbohydrate that makes the cell wall is called chitin. And chitin is also a common carbohydrate found in certain animals as well. So that makes another link why we believe fungi are more closely related to Animalia. Okay? We'll talk more about chitin when we talk about organisms like arthropods, insects, crustaceans, those kind of things. Okay? What's interesting about fungus is that their cell types are referred to as hyphae. They create these long filamentous cells referred to as hyphae. So that's the simplest structure of a fungus. It starts with the hyphae, and then those hyphae divide into long stringy mats, big mats, called mycelium. Okay? There are some fungus that are single-celled, small single-cell, and those are referred to as yeasts. And we'll talk more about yeasts in a minute. So most of the fungi are multicellular, forming these long, sometimes they're connected single cells, forming the hyphae. But we do have a few that are unicellular, mainly the yeast. There's some other ones, but mainly the yeast. So let's talk about hyphae then. What is a hypha? Okay, so you see in the lower left side there, the drawings of the hyphae there. You can see that they're just long cell types, and on the ones at the top, the two at the top, those hyphae are divided with these little walls in there that are called septa. One septum, many septa. And what that does is it divides the hyphae into individual cells that usually have one, sometimes more nuclei in it. But notice that there's a pore, there's a little hole within the septa, right in there, and that allows cytoplasm to flow through or organelles to flow through. So there's communication all up and down that filament. Okay. Some fungi cells do not have septa, and that's the bottom picture here. It's all connected. We refer to that cell type as a coencytic fungus or a coencytic hyphae. Okay. It's one elongated, multinucleated giant cell. So the ones with the septa, it's still a long cell, but they're divided into individual cells within there. So looking above, you see the microscopic view of fungus, and you can see I'm pointing at one hyphae that's sticking straight up. So all of those individual stringy material, those are each individual hyphae. And when they form a mat like that, the whole structure is called a mycelium. okay, mycelium. And so that's the main body of fungus. The mycelium, this mat of hyphae, is the main body of fungus. So you can see that tomato there. There's a fungus growing on the tomato, and you can see areas where the tomato is collapsing because, again, that fungus is releasing digestive enzymes to break down the tomato outside of its body. And then once the tomato nutritive portions become small enough, small molecules, it will then absorb right into these cells, right into the individual hyphae, nourishing the organism. Another advantage of this long cell type and tubular shape is that it allows for much more surface area. So that means more membrane along the outside, and the more membrane there is, the more contact it has with the food. And so with that contact with the food, you have more area for the nutrients to absorb into the cell. So it's a pretty efficient situation that it has going on there. Okay. So let me break it down a little. This next picture might help you see a little bit better the way that reproduction occurs and then how it grows. You can see that most fungi actually use spores. So it starts with a single spore, similar to what we learned in plants. So it's a reproductive cell, and that can form into new organisms. So you see a spore is germinating when you go down to the left, and that forms a hypha. You can see that hypha elongating, and then more and more hyphae split and branch and connect to one another, and that's forming the mycelium. And so the mycelium is the main body of the mushroom, or I'm sorry, of the fungus. I don't want to say mushroom yet. That's the main body of the mushroom. So in order to create that spore, it can do that through either asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. It does use, most fungi use both. So with asexual reproduction, there's an advantage there because you can create new individuals very quickly. But the disadvantage is, remember that they're genetically identical to the parent plant, so you're not getting any variation in genes. But with sexual reproduction, the advantage is that you get variation in genes, but it does take longer. It does involve meiosis, right? And so it's going to take longer to do, and you have to find another individual that's compatible with you. So we're going to look at each of that today. Okay? So one of the things that's difficult about this unit is just learning all of these new terms. Because these organisms are very unique, there's going to be a lot of new terms that you need to learn. So make sure that you keep up with these terms, right? Okay. So, and again, some of these terms you've heard before, but we need to get it straight in our mind how we apply it to the fungus now. So spores are made within structures called sporangia, again, just like the plants. But when we look at different groups of fungi, the term for sporangia may be a little different. So for example, we're going to look at a type of fungi called zygomycetes. And so the type of sporangia they make are called zygosporangia. Okay. Others may produce a sporangium called conidium. Alrighty, so you have to keep up with these terms. Okay, but so what you see there is that most of the mycelium, again, created from this hypha, and the hypha is usually either underground or hyphae are underground, or they embed within, like you see that piece of bread over there. And then when they're ready to reproduce, they'll extend a hyphae hypha that's aerial. That means it's extending up into the air, and then the tip of it will form the sporangium. And inside of there is where the forms will develop, where the spores will develop. So again, looking at that bread, you kind of see the black over the top. Well, if we zoomed in on that, the black that you're seeing are all those little sporangiospores where the spores are being created inside of there. So that's the part where we see. That's what will open up, releasing those spores. It will look like just this powder that's being spread all over the place, and they get distributed by wind. Okay. All right, so sporangia, an important structure. We'll also see another important structure that gets produced above ground, and that's the fruiting body. And the fruiting body is another reproductive structure. Usually this is where the sexual reproduction will take place. So different groups may use one or the other method, but sometimes they'll use both, again, depending if it's sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. So when you're looking at that red mushroom there to the left, the main bulk of the fungus, the body, is underground. Okay, all that mycelia, so you can see to the right the little cartoon picture there. So underground, you see all the fibrous hyphae forming the mycelium. Then what will happen is the mycelium will grow upward, forming this dense structure, the fruiting body. And in this case, what we're seeing is a mushroom. Okay, and so the mushroom, it's just a real packed, densely packed hyphae forming that structure. And then in a minute, we'll look underneath. And you can do this at home. You can get yourself a mushroom so that you can open up and look at the mushroom itself underneath and kind of explore it a little bit. For now, again, just realize a fruiting body is a reproductive structure. That's what makes the spores. It's part of the fungus. It's derived from hyphae, but it's the part of the fungus that grows above ground. Okay, and that makes sense for reproduction. If they need to send spores out in the air, then the reproductive structure should grow above ground or above whatever substrate that they're penetrating. Okay. And the structure of fruiting bodies just depends on their adaptation for dispersing the spores by wind. Rain can also disperse spores. Spores can get on animal bodies and they can disperse them. So there's just a wide variety of these fruiting bodies and different ways that they disperse them. So there you can see a puffball down on the left side, A, and those get filled with air until the air gets enough pressure, opens up, and enough pressure develops and it releases the spores into the air. You can step on these things and pop them, and spores will go all over the place. So there's all different types that develop. I think that one's a stinkhorn on B. Here are some other structures that you can see. Many fungi produce substances in the fruiting body to deter consumption, right? So there are they produce toxins and things like that. So humans, we like to eat mushrooms, but you have to be very careful if you are going out to pick mushrooms from the wild, because sometimes it's very hard to tell the difference between a edible mushroom and a toxic mushroom, and so you could kill yourself pretty easily. Some toxins cause liver failure, and that could require a transplant. There was a movie about a guy who was trying to live off the grid in Alaska, and he picked the wrong mushroom and ended up killing himself. It was a mushroom that prevented his digestive system from absorbing nutrients, and he ended up starving to death because he couldn't reach anybody in time to get help. So there you can see all the different types of mushrooms that we do eat, and some mushrooms affect our crops. So there's an ergot affecting that wheat right there, and so sometimes mushrooms help us, and sometimes they do harm us. So let's get a little bit into how fungi reproduce. And so with asexual reproduction, there's a couple different ways. Again, if they're single-celled, like you see on the left side with this yeast, so that's unicellular. So that means they stay unicellular. Their structure is just single cells, and these single cells then will reproduce by budding off the parent cell. That means that they divide their DNA, the cell membrane then splits, is produced down the middle of the cell, and they split into two individuals. So again, asexual reproduction, meaning that there is no change in the, and there isn't much change in the genes. We're just duplicating the genes and then splitting them to either cell so that the offspring are identical to the parent. Over to the right, you see the multicellular species. They produce what are called kinidiospores. So a kinidiospore, to put it simply, is just a type of sporangium. Okay, and then the kinidiospore produce the conidia, which are the spores that get released. Okay, I see a typo, kinidiospores. It should be conidia4. It's corrected the picture. So it's just a specialized hyphae, the conidia4, that branches upward and becomes aerial, so it branches up, and then the ends divide to produce the conidia. And then the conidia, again, those are just a type of asexual spore, and those will usually get dispersed by wind or rain or something like that. Okay, so there's all different types of spores, and we give them different names, especially in the fungi. So you have to remember that as we go through different organisms, different types of fungi, we're going to talk about spores, and they might have a little different name. So conidia is a type of spore. We're going to see ascospores. We're going to see basidiospores. We're going to see zoospores. So there's all different types of spores. Okay. So in this slide, the main portion at the bottom is showing sexual reproduction. At the top, it can show you that asexual reproduction, again, what I had just shown you. Okay, so let's run through kind of the general sexual reproduction of fungus, and then we'll get into specifics about fungus. So starting at number 1, if you see the 4 little spores toward the left side, look one above that, you see spores germinating to form a hypha, and then those hyphae will branch to form the mycelium. Okay, so right along the way, you see that all along the hyphae, they put nuclei inside of each of those segments, right? And so it's multinucleated, or these are several cells that are stacked along one another to form the hyphae. Okay, and so what'll happen is that inside those nuclei, most fungal cells have haploid nuclei. So the DNA in there is haploid. So that's a difference from plant and animal cells, right? Most of our cells in plants and animals are diploid until we're ready to produce sexual reproducing cells. Then they become haploid. But so in the fungi, again, most fungal cells are haploid nuclei, okay? So in sexual reproduction, what will happen is that the hyphae of 2 compatible mating types will come together. Okay, and that's what you see kind of in the middle of the slide there. When our hyphae developed into the mycelia, you see a blue and a red. The colors are just indicating that they're 2 different individuals, so their DNA is unique from one another, but they're compatible. In fungi, they don't have sexually reproducing parts that are different from one another. So it's not appropriate to call one male and one female. So many times what you'll read when you read about fungi is they'll refer to them as plus and minus. Those are 2 compatible mating types. So if you go down to the right to number 2, you'll see that then the mycelia of the 2 different mating types then begin to fuse at their tips. And then they come together, their cytoplasm fuses together by a process called plasmogamy. Okay, it's where the plasma, cell cytoplasm within there, they're beginning to fuse. okay, and forming one. So those cells are forming together, okay? So again, the fusion of the cytoplasm. And so now what's happening is they're mixing their nuclei together. So those cells that have fused together, now they have two haploid nuclei inside of them. So there's one nucleus from each fungus that are inside there. Okay, and then they begin to divide by mitosis to form more cells. So remember, a cell division by mitosis is then just a means to create more cells but maintain the same number of chromosomes in there. So it's maintaining the two haploid nuclei within those cells. Let me advance to the next slide because there's something different going on here that you're not used to yet. It's very unique with fungi. So when I mention that, usually when we mention sexually reproducing species like the plants, and then some of you already know this about animals, right? When the egg and the sperm came together, each with their haploid nuclei, they came together, and not only did the cells fuse together, but the nuclei fused together. So that's why it became a single-celled organism with one nucleus, but now the nucleus is diploid because it obtained the haploid chromosomes from each of the nuclei of the egg and the sperm. Well, it fused into one nucleus to become diploid. Fungi are a little bit different. So here you can see this is a process called karyogamy. So there you see the two different haploid cells, so indicated by the color. They are fusing by the plasmogamy. Okay, so that means the two cells now are fusing to become one. But look what happens in step number 3. It's one cell, but the nuclei are still distinct. The nuclei are still separate. So there are two haploid nuclei in there. We don't call it diploid because they haven't fused yet. Okay, so that situation you can see in number 3, they're referred to as dikaryotic. Di meaning two, and they have the two nuclei. So sometimes we refer to that as N plus N. So remember, haploid was N, diploid was 2N, but this one is N plus N. You have two separate structures with haploid nuclei in it within one cell. And what's interesting about fungus is they can retain this situation for several weeks to months. Okay, they can remain dikaryotic for a while. But then the two will fuse together, karyogamy. When they begin to fuse together, that's the process called karyogamy. And so then they form the diploid nucleus. Okay, and that's what you see in number 5 there. So that's called the zygote nucleus. Okay, so I'll go back to the previous slide so we can look at that with our sexual reproduction life cycle. So again, going back to number 2, you see two hyphae that are of two different mating types. They fuse together at the tips, and so through plasmogamy, they become one structure at the tip. Okay, and now they each contribute their haploid nuclei, and so at number 3, they're in a dikaryotic state. They are N plus N. Okay, then they can divide by mitosis and create several cells with the N plus N situation. They can create several dikaryotic cells. Then through karyogamy, those cells, those nuclei will fuse, and then it becomes a diploid zygote nucleus. So now it's a diploid zygote nucleus. You can see that at the end. That will divide by meiosis. So meiosis, remember, going to cut the number of, we're going to make more cells and cut the number of chromosomes in half. And actually in this case, we're making more nuclei. So 4 genetically different haploid nuclei are created. So first we just divide the nuclei, and then those get packaged within spores. They develop around the nuclei in number 5. Then that structure will release the spores. Those get out into the environment, and if they reach a suitable habitat, then those spores will germinate and form the hyphae and then develop mycelium. Okay, and spores can stay dormant again for quite a while until there is a suitable habitat, so they can resist desiccation and other things like that, and lack of nutrients. So they can stay that way until the environment becomes more hospitable to them. So this cycle of sexual reproduction, when we look at different organisms, we're actually going to layer this cycle of reproduction to specific types of fungi. Okay, so you want to study this to kind of get that idea of the haploid stage, the dikaryotic stage, and the diploid stage. And we're going to see the similarities and differences in different fungi. Okay, and again, along the top, you can see the more simple asexual reproduction there. So I'm going to end this recording so that you can review kind of the introduction to fungi. And the next part is going to be looking at what the role that fungi play in our ecosystem, and then look at individual types of fungi.